Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
As federal agencies scale back and the CISA Act expires, cybersecurity experts warn that the U.S. is more vulnerable than ever. Staffing gaps that slow threat response and weaken coordination are creating openings for adversaries. Here to explain what's at risk and how states can step up as federal support falters is the former CISO of the City of Seattle, Mike Hamilton. Mr. Hamilton, thank you so much for joining me.
Terry, thank you for asking me. I'm happy to be here.
Let's begin with the big picture. How does a government shutdown like the one we're in right now affect our cybersecurity posture?
Well, it's going to affect federal security for sure. The private sector is a little bit of a different beast, but first of all of the firings, right? I mean, we've reduced staff at CISA a lot already. And so I don't want to say a skeleton crew left over, but the skeleton crew has been turned into just a couple of bones. More importantly, I believe, is the fact that all of the contractors are suddenly not coming to work anymore. And a lot of the work that the contractors do are patching vulnerabilities and making sure that incident response is there and enabled to, take control of something that looks like it's getting a little out of hand. And as you know, when a patch is released and a vulnerability announced in a product that faces the internet, it's a race. The scanning is automated, looking for vulnerable exposures. Nation states, criminal gangs, all reverse engineer the patch so that they can build the exploit, right? And that's part of the automation as well. And so the first time that Cisco says, okay, here's a patch and we have a vulnerability, they're going to get popped because there's nobody there to join that race and get that vulnerability patched before the scanner hits them. So in addition, not having eyes on, right? We need to be watching the networks or incident response teams, because my feeling is a lot of those are contractors and or CISA, and that's who we're showing the door to, at least temporarily. That means bad actors are going to be embedding into federal agency networks and are going to be really hard to get out of there. And so, what's at risk are confidential communications about commerce and trade deals and what the military is doing and what we're planning to do in the event that China invades Taiwan, for example. So we're looking at some bad outcomes.
That's a pretty stark picture you've just painted. And on top of that, the CISA Act expired just as the shutdown began.
Yes.
So what protections did that act provide, and now what's the risk that it's lapsed?
Yeah, so the Information Sharing Act of 2015 created an insulating layer over participants that would share information so that if you disclosed something that would be competitively bad to be known, or you don't want your customers to know, you certainly don't want regulators to know, right? You don't want to get fined for that. And it created this safe space for sharing this information so that CISA could take that, repackage it anonymously, right? So we're not identifying anyone, and send that out. And now that's just all stopped. So the private sector is going to be very reluctant to share information about, how they're getting whacked. And I don't know if we can get that back. I think for a short amount of time, things may continue to work as they have. But especially when you're talking about publicly traded corporations, shareholder value is a big deal. And so you don't let certain things get public. So they're going to be really reluctant. And, the SEC has this 4-day reporting rule and things like that. So it's going to be in conflict with that. I mean, they don't have a choice, but I think they're going to be very careful about what they disclose in those 8K filings.
Putting both of those together, the shutdown and the expiration of the CISA Act, what would you say are the biggest cyber risks that both the government and the public sector at large are facing?
Well, the public sector at large, I think that, the other thing we lost is a state local cyber grant program, right? Without a reauthorization of that, local governments have nothing to fall back on. And it's very difficult for local governments to fund cybersecurity. You have to have a great tax base. You have to have willing executives and elected leaders. And both those are in short supply. The biggest risks I see, though, are to the, again, confidential communications within federal agencies, including the DoD, but also the continuity of operations for those federal agencies. We don't want the VA falling over. I hesitate to think that ransomware is a risk, but it probably is. I think that the espionage agents want preferential access, they don't want the ransomware people in there either. So there's going to be a little bit of a conflict between nation states and criminal gangs to see who gets that agency first.
I'm speaking with Mike Hamilton. He's the former CISO of the city of Seattle and field CISO of Lumify Cybersecurity. You've laid out a pretty grim picture there. Let's talk about critical infrastructure, particularly when federal cybersecurity is disrupted. How does that open the door to things like power plants and water processing and those kinds of things that cities and states are going to be worried about?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So in the ecosystem of critical infrastructure protection, so I was on the state, local, tribal, and territorial government coordinating council. And that was one government coordinating council, and all of the other critical sectors, dams, water, finance, energy, they all have government coordinating councils and sector coordinating councils and ISACs and sector risk management agencies. So for example, EPA regulates water, Health and Human Service, they regulate healthcare. That entire ecosystem is now in question. Without federal leadership to conduct government coordinating councils and bring the private sector to the table under what are called the CPAC rules with a designated federal officer there so that they can share this information, they're just not going to do it, right? Without that federal leadership, it's going to be really hard for organizations to voluntarily do that. So states, because of the executive order that says that state and local government is now responsible for infrastructure protection and disaster management, states are necessarily going to have to step up and recreate what they can out of that ecosystem. So information sharing, for example, I'm in Washington State. A lot of our power comes from falling water. Get the dams together, bring them in, talk about things, let them know what threats are out there, get them to report on things that they have monitored and want everybody else to know. Okay, we could probably put something like that together. Volunteer organizations for incident response. Wisconsin does a fantastic job with this. Michigan does as well. So in Washington State, we're patterning what we do after Wisconsin. Some states have already started to apply grant programs internally from state funds to local governments, California in particular. Other states, Texas and California, I think Nebraska as well, and there are others, are setting up state operation centers so that they have statewide telemetry. And when I say that, they want to monitor their local governments. And I think this is going to be a sea change. I think local governments, cities and counties are going to be monitored by state governments. And, unfortunately, that freezes out the private sector, managed detection and response vendors. But I think this is the way we have to go. We are being forced to do this by the federal government. Lastly, I would say, there are some states that are already starting to regulate their own critical infrastructure sectors. New York, in particular, regulates its finance sector and its healthcare sector, much in the way that the SEC and Health and Human Services do. And they're doing this to circumvent the dysfunctionality of Congress. You're regulated. You're not. We don't know what's going on with the sector risk management agencies ever since the EPA got sued after they said, hey, we want you to do a cyber risk assessment and submit that along with your sanitary survey that you're required to do anyway. And so the whole ecosystem, I call it an ecosystem, is all in question. But I do see states stepping up to recreate the parts that they can.
Do you see this as a permanent shift? This used to be a very collaborative space between federal and state governments. As the federal government appears to be weaker, are states going to have to step up permanently? And how difficult is it to collaborate across 50 different states?
Well, I don't have the crystal ball about whether or not this is going to be permanent. It kind of depends on, what the federal government is. So my feeling, though, is once these things are put in place, they're not going to go away. If states are going to do things like set up their own grant programs, regulate their own critical, and think about the patchwork that is going to create for compliance. If 50 states have 50 different regulatory regimes for healthcare, for example, and then somebody loses records and some of the people in the records that have been lost are in 17 states, it's going to be really hard to comply. So, we're looking at creating a little bit of a mess, without federal statutes in place. But I do think once those things are put in place, they're going to be fairly permanent.
I've been speaking with Mike Hamilton. He is the former CISO of the city of Seattle and the field CISO of Lumify Cybersecurity. Thanks so much for this very clear picture.
Terry, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed talking to you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.